The history of British fascism tends to be dominated by Oswald Mosley and his British Union of Fascists, itself a very atypical fascist organisation. However, the conversion to fascism by Baronet Mosley, a man who in his time was touted as both leader for the Conservative Party and Labour Party, didn't happen until 1931 when he visited Mussolini in Italy. And the British Union of Fascists wasn't formed until 1932. Mosley wasn't Britain's first taste of fascism then, by far, just its only remembered one. Few appreciate long before Mosley, Britain had a flourishing right-wing scene of would-be Nazis and fascists, all trying to work out what these strange continental ideologies were, with varying degrees of quirkiness. By the 1930s, such names as the Imperial Fascist League, the British Empire Fascists, the Fascist League, the National Fascisti, the Kensington Fascist Party, the Yorkshire Fascists, the Empire Fascist League, the Social Credit Greenshirts, the British Fascisti, the British United Fascists, the National Workers' Party, the National Socialist League, the Nordic League, and the Right Club, all would have been commonplace in the right-wing scene. It was one of these aforementioned groups, the British Fascisti, to whom the honour of being the first British fascist group falls. The story begins in 1908, when Baden-Powell formed the Boy Scouts. Girls were forbidden to join, Baden-Powell feeling the activities too unladylike. However, 2 years later, at the first Scout rally held at Crystal Palace, he was surprised to see a troop of Girl Scouts march past him. One of the Scout mistresses responsible for this illegal Girl Scout troop was Blackshirts Lintorn-Orman, and one of the girls, her 15-year-old daughter, Rotha Lintorn-Orman. The girls had got away with joining the Scout movement by putting only their first name's initial on the application form, and their deception had escaped notice, with their troop being located in rural Liphook, far from any other Scout organisation. The act forced Baden-Powell's hand. Shortly after, he formed a female version of the Scouts, and a year later, Rotha was leader of her own Scout troop, the only troop in the country with royal patronage, Princess Louise's own Bournemouth troop. This female act of defiance seems to have been the first step in a life of breaching male social convention for the young Rotha Lintorn-Orman, and gives us insight into the unique upbringing she had at the hands of her mother. And we can also guess it was perhaps from this incident that Rotha developed her love of uniforms, because for the rest of her life she would be wearing a uniform, either a British Army uniform, a Red Cross uniform, or a uniform of her own personal adult scout troop. And to the ranks of this adult scout troop she would attract such figures as William Joyce, known as Lord Haw-Haw, and Maxwell Knight, who Ian Fleming would include in his own James Bond books as M. Rotha was the daughter of a British Army major, and her grandfather was Field Marshal John Linton Arabin Simmons. She grew up in a minor gentry household, able to afford a servant. When World War I broke out, like many women, Rotha went to work, but unlike many, she did it by joining the army as an ambulance driver, serving in the Reserve Ambulance Corps, and later the Scottish Women's Hospital Corps, with whom she won the Croix du Chariot twice for bravery, serving on the Drins front in Serbia. In 1917 she was invalided back home with malaria, where she joined the Red Cross and became commandant of the motor school at Devonshire House, in charge of training ambulance drivers, and seems to have led a normal life up until 1922, when Mussolini marched on Rome at the head of his own troop of Boy Scouts. In Britain, it caused heads more to shake than to turn at this strange form of foreign mysticism called fascism. It was to have a lasting effect on Rotha, though. The legend goes, Rotha was in the garden of her Somerset home, planting vegetables, and alarmed by the Labour Party, the growing influence of the trade union movement, and Vladimir Lenin, when an epiphany struck her to start a fascist party in Britain. In 1923, just a few months after Mussolini's march to power, Rotha placed several adverts in the right-wing journal, The Patriot, which read, "Seeking anti-communists," and within weeks, and most likely to her surprise, a lot of people replied. She makes the claim 200,000 anti-communists signed up to her party, though this claim seems ridiculously wild. Her mother then signed over £50,000 of the family fortune to Rotha to run the new movement. Rotha then doesn't only enjoy the unprecedented curiosity of being a woman who founded and led a fascist party. In 1923, Britain was still months short of its third ever woman MP. Women at the time only had limited suffrage by age, wealth and educational level, and only had that for 5 years. Rotha was the first woman to found and lead a political party of any kind. A party she would name the British Fascisti. But what exactly was the British Fascisti? And what was a British fascist? 10 years later, Oswald Mosley was to wrestle with this question, realizing German and Italian forms of fascism were not really suited to Britain. But at least it could be said Mosley understood what fascism was and why he was modifying it. What Rotha seems to have built is anything but a fascist movement. It's often taken by modern readers as a derogatory put-down that at the time many people said Rotha wanted to create an adult scout troop. However, early scouting was quite different from its modern counterpart. Scouts carried Union Jacks, and Baden-Powell had based the movement not on the militaristic Boys Brigade, but the individualist thinking Cadet Corps he was in command of during the Second Boer War. Scouting was about bushcraft, frontiersmanship, and survival skills. Rotha's idea of the role of the movement is perhaps the most unique thing about it and explains its unusual methods. She had a millenarian bent, believing the coming communist revolution in Britain was unstoppable. And the fascisti's role was not so much to become a political force or to take power, but to try and create trained, disciplined, self-sufficient people to get the country up and running again after the communist revolution. In this respect, the image Rotha had of her British Fascisti was akin to the survivalist or preppy movement in the United States, preparing for the Holocaust. The role of women in the Fascisti was equal to that of men, even training-wise. Female members complained they were expected to change the tyres on vehicles the same as men. While the suffragette movement had ended long before Rotha grew up, this didn't stop her having strong opinions on equalising voting rights for men and women. In fact, while most of the suffragette movement had died, one area of radicalism old suffragettes continued in was right-wing politics, such as the Pankhurst's Anti-Socialist League. In fact, several former suffragette far-right groups existed. Membership of the Fascisti didn't just attract feminists, though, but perhaps the most reactionary element of society: the legions of middle-class, middle-aged military wives and widows. It's unclear how many women were in the British Fascisti, but they outnumbered the men by quite a considerable amount. And one of the lasting legacies of the British Fascisti being fascist feminism, as later Oswald Mosley's Blackshirts had to tone down the sexist elements of British fascism, much to the derision of leading German Nazis. In fact, 25% of Mosley's Blackshirt organisation was female, and so many women marched with him on his marches he had to ban female members from wearing black-coloured skirts to stop the press dubbing his movement the Black Skirts. Apart from the unions and strange marching, politics-wise, fascism was another curiosity to the British brain at the time, and it didn't really comprehend fascism. Other European countries had had the advantage of centuries of absolute monarchies, centralized governments or dictatorships in their recent history. Britain hadn't had anything like that, so got fascism very wrong. For example, Rotha herself was to dislike Mosley, branding him a communist. It's quite ironic when the first fascist in Britain sees a man who actually does understand fascism a communist. The British Fascisti itself spent much of its efforts providing stewards for Conservative Party meetings, which in those days were known to come under disruption from communists and socialists. The Fascisti also openly encouraged its members to vote Conservative, and its two main political stances seemed to be that the government should pass anti-union laws and equalise voting for women. And it has been suggested that the Fascisti can actually be considered as a version of the Conservative Party's Primrose League, a club run since the 19th century for women conservatives whose entire leadership committee were men. Perhaps then the British Fascisti can be seen as an early version of feminism, a uniformed, marching, tire-changing, jiu-jitsu fighting, millenarian, survivalist, conservative voting, Union Jack waving Girl Scout troop. The British Fascisti then was more a paramilitary group than a political party. While it did stand candidates, the pinnacle of its electoral success was winning just 2 local council seats. However, on the professionalism of its paramilitary side, it put the British Union of Fascists to shame. Fearing imminent communist takeover of Britain, the British Fascisti had adopted both paramilitary and intelligence wings. Its intelligence wing was run by Maxwell Knight, who upon leaving the Navy had become impressed by Mussolini and joined the British Fascisti. Knight organised the intelligence wing of the British Fascisti so well he was noticed and recruited by MI5 to become Britain's top spy master, and the figure M in the James Bond movies is based upon him. Knight was said to have had members of the Fascisti infiltrate the Communist Party, trade union movement and the Labour Party. Ironically, just over a decade later, as spymaster, he would be sending his agents out to infiltrate the British Union of Fascists and other right-wing groups. It was Knight who was responsible for the internment of many British Nazis and Fascists during the Second World War, including Mosley and many of his former British Fascisti comrades. Knight was also the first member of the MI5 to suspect the communist leanings of some of its members. However, he wasn't believed by his superiors, perhaps because of his earlier membership of the British Fascisti, and it was wary of anti-communist claims by him. Finally, it was Knight, a former member of a political group led by a woman, who introduced women to MI5 on equal status to men. The paramilitary wing of the Fascisti run on strict military principles. Members wore uniforms based upon the Italian Blackshirts. It was divided into regional troops, district and county commands, a central command in London, presided over by a chief of staff. Both men and women received the same military training, including jiu-jitsu and survival techniques. It was claimed, at least, there were 800 commands, with 200 to 500 members in each. When the commands took to organising street patrols from 1924, the highly unusual sight for the time of militaristic marching and drilled groups of uniformed women was unleashed upon the bemused British public. These women's street patrols, according to interviews with ex-members, seem to have been one of the main draws for women members. During the general strike of 1926, the Fascisti's female members were expected, alongside the men, to engage in violence if needed. Some quite notorious historical figures also passed through the ranks of the British Fascisti, many leaving to join more extreme Nazi groups. 2 of these were William Joyce and Arnold Leese. William Joyce, who defected to Germany at the outbreak of World War II and became the infamous Lord Haw, broadcasting English-language propaganda from Berlin, got his facial scar while at a British Fascisti parade. He believed a Jewish communist responsible, and the incident is said to be the source of his fervent Nazism. Arnold Leese, on the other hand, was a vet and a militant vegetarian, teetotal and animal rights fanatic. He is perhaps the most fanatical anti-Semite Britain has ever produced, despite having no belief in Nazi racial ideology, and having no objection to Jews other than kosher food being cruel to animals. Leese, who left the British Fascisti in 1924 and formed the Imperial Fascist League in 1928, claimed he found no fascism in the British Fascisti, just conservatism with knobs on. The demise of the Fascisti came from being both too moderate for some and too extreme for others. A large section broke away in 1926 to join the male-dominated non-fascist organisation for maintenance and supplies, the dispute being sex and politics based. Many moderate conservatives left because they found the organisation too extreme. Much more of the membership was lost to newer, genuine fascist organisations, people being disillusioned by the tame fascism of the group. Groups like the National Fascisti, the Imperial Fascist League, were to whittle away members from the British Fascisti. However, a lot of female members continued their membership, not wishing to be in a male-led group. When Oswald Mosley formed the British Union of Fascists, union was an idealistic term, as he didn't really have ideas of giving the other groups the choice of whether they were going to join or not. Fascist groups that refused to unite under his leadership, he would either force to do with violence or destroy. The last large section of the Fascisti defected to Mosley, led by Neil Francis Hawkins in 1932. The remaining anti-Mosley Fascisti was down to 500 members and found themselves under constant violent attack from his Blackshirts. Britain's first fascists were ultimately killed by Britain's last fascists. Rotha herself came under much criticism for her masculinity. She never married, always worked men's jobs, and was never seen out of uniform. She would play Santa Claus herself at the fascist children's club Christmas parties, and won fancy dress contests dressed as a grandfather. Rotha also after World War I had become increasingly dependent on drugs and alcohol. Like so many men who saw similar service, she was most likely suffering from shell shock and paranoia, the latter of which may have fueled her communist takeover scenario. Shortly before her death in 1935, at just 40 years old, her mother cut her allowance off to her, believing the members of the British Fascisti were supplying her drugs for cash. Had she lived, unlike other prominent British fascist leaders, it's doubtful she would have been interned during World War II. A Home Office report in the 1930s assessing the dangers to national security of the various organising Britain reads, it considered her a harmless lunatic.